Please comment where you are watching from, and please subscribe if you enjoy the content. I took a long weekend, because my brain felt like a buzzing phone I couldn't switch off. Ridgeway Loop kept popping up in a forum thread. Moderate, great overlooks, hardly anyone out there. One reply had stuck with me: blazes move up there. Keep your head on a swivel. Another account, ghosted since last year, mentioned a guy named Tanner Kincaid who never came back. People joked, then the mod locked the comments. That's what sold me, I guess. Quiet plus a story you're not supposed to tell. I rolled in before sunrise, the lot empty, my old Cherokee ticking as it cooled. The air out there didn't feel recycled. Cold cut right through the city dust in my lungs. The first miles were as easy as promised. Straight, cathedral-tall trunks. A soft underfoot crumble that let me hear my own steps without drowning me in them. I pitched near a glass-clear creek, boiled noodles on a pocket stove, and went quiet in a way I forgot existed. That night I watched a small fire burn down until stars found the gaps in the canopy. I slept like a door closing. Morning bit, bright enough to sting the eyes. I took a day pack, water, bars, compass, the cheap map folded to show the ridge spurs, and went hunt the overlook everyone bragged about. The climb steepened in a hurry, but it was the good hurt. A burn you earn. The blazes thinned, then vanished. I backtracked 10 paces, scanning trunks for that stamp of orange. Nothing. The path still looked stamped in and honest, so I trusted my boots and kept moving. The first wrong thing was the rope. It hung from a low oak like a tired noose, frayed and blackened. The branch above it was burned in a perfect ring, like someone had cored the limb with a hot iron. No other scorch on the tree. I stood there way too long, mouth tasting like pennies, trying to make it a prank. I took out my phone for a photo and hesitated, felt stupid, but I didn't want the image living in my pocket. I kept moving. Bones came next, chalk pale against wet leaves. Not a whole skeleton, just a scatter. A rib. A long tapering piece that wanted to be a femur, but looked stretched. Deer, my head offered, automatic, like naming it made it obey a rule. My gut didn't buy it. That's when the forest changed. It didn't grow quieter, it shut off. 1 second there were woodpecks and wind. The next, my breathing was the loudest thing in the world. I turned around, and the trail I'd trusted felt like it shrugged. Trees crowded closer, slopes skewed sharper, landmarks unhooked themselves. I couldn't see the rope, or the bones, or the bright creak of obvious choices. I told myself a rule out loud just to hear a voice. Downhill finds water, water finds roads. I flipped open the compass from my grandfather's tackle box and set a bearing toward the creek I'd camped on. Then I made a decision that felt like it mattered. I took the knife, the map, the compass, and 2 waters out of the day pack and ditched the rest. If I was wrong, I'd pay for it. If I was right, I didn't need a bag slowing me when the slope turned mean. I took 1 step and heard it breathe. Not a deer's nervous huff or a bear's wet rumble. This was long, syrup-thick inhaling through a throat that didn't know how to do it right. Then the exhale scratched out of something raw. I went still. The breath came again, closer, threaded through with a mumble like a person trying on language. The words slipped and broke apart, as if whatever was making them had watched us from a distance, then tried to sound human without understanding the joints. Then wood groaned, something heavy leaning into bark. I didn't wait for more. I ran. Branches scored my arms. My shins took 3 hits in a row that would bloom the next day into galaxy bruises I didn't remember getting. My compass needle jittered and then settled. I kept it in the corner of my eye like a poem I'd been assigned to memorize. My lungs clawed for air. The silence ran with me. Blue flashed through trunks, my tarp. I stumbled into camp like I'd burst from a tunnel. The fire ring still held a smudge of ash. I didn't bother with the tent. I snatched the compass cord from around my neck, cinched my belt tighter, and went for the downhill run like gravity owed me a favor. I made the mistake of looking back. It stood between 2 birches up the ridge, tall enough to brush the first branch if it wanted. Arms hung long, past the knees, fingers like wet twigs. Its skin wasn't pale or dark, it was the color of bark after rain, slick and almost pulsing when it moved a fraction. The head tilted to a dog's question angle, then further, too far, like the neck didn't have stops. Its mouth opened. No roar. It pulled my name out of itself, slow and threadbare, and drew it until the syllable scraped. Jace. Nobody on the loop had said my name. I hadn't spoken it since I left town. I ran until the trees cracked open into gravel. A road. I spat blood. I'd bitten my tongue somewhere in the blur, and limped the line until a square green box hove up out of the woods like a ship, the ranger station. I went in with my chest hitching and hands empty. The woman at the desk wore a stitched tag, Rivas, and the frown of someone deciding if you're trouble. I tried something neutral. Got turned around. My voice sounded like I'd borrowed it. She had me sit, put water in my hand, and took my name and route. When she came back from the back room, she said, "Mr. Harlan, you went 7 miles off any marked trail." She tapped a laminated map. "We don't have blazes up there." I followed them. I said before I could stop myself. "Orange." Forum said they move. Her face didn't change. That was the first scare. I told her about the rope because it felt like a safer confession than the voice that knew me. She didn't take notes on that part. She just stared at my face like it might tell her if I was lying to myself. "Burned ring on a limb," I said. Rope looked old. Rivas's eyes flicked, involuntary, toward a corkboard with old Polaroids stapled to it. She caught herself and looked back at me. "Lightning takes odd bites out here," she said too quickly. "You see bear?" "No." She exhaled like she was making a decision she didn't want to own. "We cut a rope off an oak up there in 2008, she said. "Camp kids. Stupid thing. We hauled it out and burned the rest of the branch. There isn't a rope there anymore." I didn't say anything. I didn't have anything to say that didn't sound like I'd stayed too long at the fire and dreamed bad. She stood, already done with me. "We'll radio if we find your gear," she said. "Stick to marked loops, Mr. Harlan. And don't answer if something in the trees calls your name." It was the way she said if that reached cold fingers down my back. I drove until the ridges flattened into farmland and the mountains became a smudge in the rear view, and still my ears felt packed with that heavy, turned-off quiet. That night, I opened the forum out of spite. The Ridgeway thread was locked. A new, short post had been pinned above it by the mod. No comment allowed. It read, "Do not call names in the woods." The boot prints shouldn't have been there. I'd been hiking the Monongahela backcountry for 3 days, following a trail that barely deserved the name, more like a deer path with occasional blazes carved into oak bark decades ago. My GPS showed I was still 2 miles from Shelter 47, but the sun was already kissing the ridgeline, painting the West Virginia hollows in shades of amber and shadow. That's when I saw them. Fresh prints in the mud beside Laurel Creek, where the trail crossed on a makeshift log bridge. Boot treads, size 11 or 12, pressed deep into the soft earth. But something was wrong with them. The heel struck normal, but the toe. Christ, the toe stretched forward at least 4 inches longer than any human foot should. And the stride, I paced it off, nearly 6 feet between steps. I knelt beside the clearest print, pulling out my phone to snap a photo. The tread pattern was familiar, looked like standard hiking boots, maybe Merrill or Vask. But that elongated shape made my skin crawl. I followed the trail of prints for maybe 50 yards before they just stopped. Not at a rock outcrop or stream crossing where someone might have jumped. They ended mid-stride in a patch of soft moss, as if whoever, or whatever, had been walking simply vanished into thin air. The rational part of my brain cycled through explanations. Maybe someone with prosthetics. Maybe the mud had shifted, distorting the shape. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But my gut knew better. In 20 years of hiking these mountains, I'd never seen anything like it. I pushed on as darkness crept through the canopy. My headlamp carved a narrow tunnel of light through the forest, illuminating the familiar chaos of rhododendron and mountain laurel that choked these ridges. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up toward the shelter. My legs burned, but I kept a steady pace. I'd learned long ago that stopping in these woods after dark was asking for trouble. Not from anything supernatural, just the usual hazards of twisted ankles and getting turned around. The fire tower appeared first, a skeletal silhouette against the star-drunk sky. I'd seen it on the topo maps, built by the CCC in the 1930s, abandoned sometime after the war. The metal framework looked solid enough, but the wooden cab at the top had partially collapsed, leaving jagged beams pointing at odd angles like broken fingers. Shelter 47 sat another 100 yards past the tower, exactly where my map said it would be. Standard 3-sided Adirondack design, built from local timber with a corrugated metal roof. A fire ring sat out front, cold ashes scattered by wind and rain. I swept my light across the interior, wooden sleeping platform, mouse-chewed logbook, the usual graffiti carved into the back wall. Home sweet home. I set up my sleeping bag and fired up my camp stove for dinner. Dehydrated chili mac, the breakfast of champions and dinner of the desperate. While it rehydrated, I flipped through the shelter logbook. Most entries were standard hiker fare, trail conditions, weather reports, the occasional philosophical rambling about finding oneself in nature. But one entry from 3 weeks ago caught my attention. Strange sounds all night. Clicking from the woods. Didn't sleep. Left at first light. NK. Another from a month before that. Something circling the shelter after midnight. Recommend camping elsewhere. Trail Angel. I closed the logbook and tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Every shelter had its ghost stories. Hikers loved to spook each other with tales of mysterious sounds and unexplained phenomena. Hell, I'd contributed a few myself over the years. But as I settled into my sleeping bag around 10 p.m., I couldn't stop thinking about those boot prints. The clicking started just after midnight. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the kind of auditory hallucinations that come from sleeping alone in the deep woods. But then it came again. Click. Click, click. A sharp, metallic sound, like someone tapping two stones together. It seemed to come from the direction of the fire tower. I lay still listening. The clicking continued, irregular but persistent. Click. Long pause. Click, click, click. Another pause. Then an answering series from somewhere to my left. Then another from behind the shelter. My blood went cold. There were multiple sources. I reached for my headlamp and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing but trees and shadows. I clicked it off and the forest fell back into darkness. Almost immediately the clicking resumed, but now it seemed to follow a pattern. 3 quick clicks from the tower direction. A pause. Then 3 answering clicks from the woods behind me. Call and response. I turned my headlamp back on, this time blinking it deliberately. 3 quick flashes. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs. The forest stayed silent for maybe 10 seconds. Then, from at least 6 different directions, came a chorus of clicking. Dozens of sharp, staccato sounds erupting from the darkness like some kind of twisted applause. I was out of my sleeping bag and stuffing gear into my pack before conscious thought kicked in. Every instinct screamed at me to get the hell out of there. I didn't bother with the camp stove or most of my gear, just grabbed my pack, water, and headlamp and headed for the trail. But the clicking followed me. As I stumbled down the rocky path, trying to navigate by the narrow beam of my light, the sounds moved through the forest parallel to my route. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just beyond the reach of my vision. Whatever was making those sounds was fast, faster than anything human had a right to be in terrain this rough. I remembered the creek crossing from earlier and made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of following the trail, I crashed through the underbrush toward the sound of running water. Laurel Creek was maybe 30 yards off the main path, tumbling down the mountainside over moss-slick rocks. I waded in without hesitation. The water was shockingly cold, probably fed by springs higher up the ridge. But I knew from years of hiking that most predators, natural or otherwise, avoided crossing running water when they could help it. Something about the sound masking their approach, maybe, or just instinctive caution. The clicking stopped as soon as I entered the stream. I followed the creek downstream for what felt like hours, stumbling over submerged rocks, fighting through overhanging branches. My boots filled with water and my legs went numb from the cold, but I didn't dare leave the stream bed. Every time I considered climbing back to the trail, I'd hear a faint click from the darkness above. Dawn found me 3 miles downstream, hypothermic and exhausted, at a Forest Service road. A passing ranger picked me up around 7 a.m. Tom Hendricks, a guy I'd met on previous trips. He wrapped me in an emergency blanket and drove me back to the ranger station, listening to my story with the kind of professional patience that suggested he'd heard similar tales before. "You said Shelter 47? He asked as we pulled into the station parking lot. "Yeah, up past the old fire tower. About 2 miles north of the Laurel Creek crossing." Tom frowned. "We'll send someone up to collect your gear, but there's no Shelter 47 in that area. Hasn't been for decades." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "It's right there on the map. I slept in it." He pulled out a current trail map and spread it across his desk. "See? Shelter 46 here, Shelter 48 about 8 miles north. But nothing in between. There used to be a shelter up there, built by the CCC in the late 30s. But it burned down in 1947. Some kind of accident. We never rebuilt it." "That's impossible. I have photos." But when I pulled out my phone, my hands started shaking. The photos were there, all right. The shelter interior, the logbook, even a shot of the metal number tag nailed to the front post. But the tag in the photo read Shelter 23, not 47. I'd never seen Shelter 23 in my life. Tom's team found my food bag and camp stove the next day, scattered around the base of the old fire tower. But they confirmed what he'd told me: no shelter anywhere in the area. Just the tower ruins and a few concrete foundation blocks hidden under decades of leaf litter. The cabin sits so far off the road, maps get shy about it. My great-grandfather hauled the timbers up by mule and habit. One room, a pot-bellied stove, a propane lantern that makes the air taste like coins, and a bed that sags in the middle like an old grin. No power, no plumbing. Signal dies a mile before you reach the rutted turnoff. It's where my parents go in November to remember that deer meat doesn't come from fluorescent light. I went alone because school had sanded my brain down to the quick. 3 weeks of papers at 3 a.m., coffee that tasted like panic, and the kind of insomnia where every email subject line ends up crowding your eyelids when you try to sleep. I wanted to hear nothing on purpose. By the time I parked at the end of the track and hiked the last half mile, my pack had turned to a brick I was politely carrying. But when the cabin slid out of the trees, dark wood, crooked porch, I felt something unclench that no nap had touched. I unlocked the door, pushed through the stale cold, and put my hand flat on the table like a person greeting a friend who doesn't talk much. It smelled like old pine, metal, mouse, and the ghost of 100 fires. I did the ritual, swept mouse droppings into a dustpan, shoot a desiccated spider off the lantern hood, primed the pump for a trickle of iron-cold water, and lit the stove. Chili went into the pot, because that's what we always do here. I ate with my coat on and read by lantern until the words turned to water. At midnight I locked the door, threw the deadbolt, checked the window latches twice, then added the petty extra, chair angled under the knob. Out here, you double-check everything. It felt satisfying the way a tight knot does. I woke on a detail, not a sound. The room was gray with dawn, and something snagged my focus like a burr. I swung my feet to the cold floor and saw it, the deadbolt thrown open. The chair not under the knob anymore, but nudged aside like an apology. I sat there a long minute, heart climbing my throat. Brains are generous with rationalizations when they want to be. Maybe I dreamwalked. Maybe it never slid all the way. Maybe the wood swelled and it sprung. I relocked it and told myself to stop being dramatic. I made coffee on the stove that tasted like pennies in comfort, took it to the porch, and watched the trees hold their breath. It was one of those winter-washed mornings where color gives up. All grays, browns, and the whites that stick low in the hollows long after they're gone everywhere else. It was quiet in a way that isn't peaceful so much as complete. Every squirrel felt like a footstep. By late afternoon, I'd convinced myself I'd invented last night's carelessness. I ate, cleaned, read the same page 3 times, then checked the bolts again. Click. Click. Chair back under the knob. The little horseshoe above the door, my grandfather's joke, got an extra pat. Dark doesn't arrive gradual out there, it drops. I was rocking in the chair by the stove in that drowsy place where your body agrees to sleep before your brain does when the porch boards groaned. A single long, complaining sound like a hand pressing down. I stopped breathing. The groan came again, weight shifting, slow. The doorknob didn't rattle. No scratching. Just pressure walking the length of the porch. It paused by the window. The wall changed sound. Close, a presence on the other side of one bad decision. I eased up, every hinge in me squeaking louder than the floor. The rifle in the corner looked like a prop in the wrong movie. I took it anyway, the cold of the steel resolving something ugly and simple in my gut. At the window, I pinched the curtain and peeled back a sliver. Wavy glass turns the world into a dream that doesn't like you. The yard was just layered dark. Snow held in a few shady places like mold. My face was a pale smear, too bright. Behind it, nothing. Not branches. Not a deer. Not anything you could name, and thereby shrink. The boards creaked again by the far corner, then silence so hard it made my ears ring. I rechecked the locks and tried to be a person who slept. The stove popped. My heart made a noise like a trapped bird. It might have been 5 minutes. It might have been an hour. I woke because the light changed. A pale wash slid across the opposite wall, and for a second I thought dawn had hurried, but when I sat up the moon had only just cleared the trees. Something stood in the yard. At first my brain nested it in the wrong box. Tall man. Coat. Hat. That collapsed when it turned. It didn't turn like a person turns. It hinged. The head tilted back as if scenting something that didn't belong to the air, then tilted further, a degree past what neck is supposed to allow. The moon found its eyes and made 2 flat coins out of them, not shining from within, just reflecting wrong. I lifted the rifle and the barrel bobbed, not because the rifle was heavy but because my hands had switched allegiance to fear. The thing slid forward half a step. Not a walk. A correction, like someone moving a chess piece they'd already let go of. I put the sights where a heart should be on a person, though I already knew it wouldn't matter. It paused, like my aim meant something, then withdrew into the trees without a sound, as if it had simply decided we were done for now. I sat on the floor until the light bleached the window gray. Outside, the yard told the truth the night had hidden. Tracks, for long toes, each ending in a blunt, almost hoofless claw. The prints sank deep, heavier than they should have been for something that moved that softly. They circled the cabin once, then again, then a third time tight, as if drawing a line. Right up to the porch. Onto the porch. Right to the door. The knob was smudged with something that looked like wet dust. The horseshoe above the door had been flipped upside down. In the dirt beside the porch steps someone had scraped lines. Not letters. Not random. Geometric, but not neat. Circles nested, broken with 3 inward hooks. Crosshatches that didn't meet. A long, curve-backed figure like a question mark repeated 4 times, each a little off. I didn't step in them. I didn't step near them. The air above those marks felt sick, like a burn you can't see. I should have left then. But the thought of walking the trail out with that thing between me and the road turned my knees to water. The cabin felt small, but it had corners. I went back inside and sat with the rifle, and made a plan that was mostly a stall. Then I remembered the ledger. It lives on the top shelf with the wasp nests, and the playing cards with 3 queens of hearts. My grandfather's hand fills it for 40 years. Weather, deer sightings, notes like pump loses prime and replace flue gasket. About a third in, the ink changes. The handwriting loosens. The notes begin to bend. Salt the sill. Iron in the jams. Then a page of doodles that weren't jokes. The same question mark hook. The nested circle broken, at a point, like an eye with a cataract. A set of instructions written as if to himself. Keep the horseshoe mouth up. Don't answer. If it says your name, that's not you hearing it. That's it hearing you. I loaded the salt tin into my palm like a weird last resort, and poured a thin line across the threshold. I wedged iron nails in the door jamb the way the ledger sketched, too low, too high. I righted the horseshoe, so the luck wouldn't pour out. I took the knife and carved the broken circle on the inside baseboard where no one would see it but me. It felt foolish until it didn't. The woods went from quiet to held. By dusk the cabin had shrunk to just the edges of the lantern. The stove breathed. I breathed. Everything else felt suspended. Around 11, the steps came. Heavier now. The boards bowed and exhaled. A tap on the window, soft as a fingertip. Another on the far wall. Then a slow, deliberate scrape that rose and fell with the height of the logs, like something dragging its nails along the outside, testing the grain. It moved around me, not random, sampling. A long breath feathered through the cracks, wet and curious. The lantern flame jittered, leaned, straightened. Then the voice arrived. E. It stuck on the first vowel, like it was trying the word on. Then again, closer to the door. E like as. Hearing your name come out of a throat you haven't met does a special thing to the inside of your bones. There's a reflex in you that stands up when called. It knows how to answer, even when you don't want it to. I clamped my teeth and stared at the salt line until my eyes watered. The voice paced the walls. It found the stove flue and tried my name down that metal throat, and for a second the pipe rang with it. It was wrong in the way a child's drawing of a face is wrong, almost there, off by enough to let the wrongness shine through. The syllables dragged like they'd come over stone. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I didn't blink when something pressed against the door hard enough to make the wood tick. The chair under the knob scooted a fraction, little rubber foot squealing. The deadbolt held. Under the door, the salt line puckered and jumped. I watched a single crystal flip and skitter like a flea. When it settled, nothing had crossed. The voice stopped. The scraping moved to the window again. A thin quill of something worked into the crack between sash and sill and sawed gently, back and forth, back and forth. I smelled copper and sweet rot, like fruit gone too far in a warm kitchen. The quill withdrew. When it came back, it went deeper. The wood began to give off thin curls that fell to the floor in pale shavings. One of them landed on my hand. It was warm. At some point exhaustion tackled me hard enough that I lost time. When the room was bright, my neck hurt like I'd slept in a truck seat. The lantern was out. The stove had gone to a red ghost. The door stood exactly as I'd left it, bolt thrown, chair pinned. I stepped outside and stopped on the threshold. More tracks. Twice as many. The porch boards held damp prints that only looked like feet if you turned your head sideways and pretended. The marks in the dirt had multiplied and clarified, the broken circle now closed, then broken again, then closed. A path of symbols ran from the porch to the pump and back like a written argument I couldn't read. In one of the deep-toed dents was a sliver of something translucent, like a fish scale. When I touched it with my knife tip, it flexed and went still, light pulsing under it once the way a belly does when it remembers hunger. I didn't pack carefully. I put food and the ledger in my bag and left the blankets to the mice. I slung the rifle, locked the door because habit wins even when it's pointless, and ran the trail to the car with my shadow trying to pass me on the turns. I didn't stop until the county road spit me out into cell service, and my phone vomited all the messages I'd missed. I didn't go home. I sat in a fast food lot and stared at people like they were a rare bird. I told myself I was hiking to clear my head. The truth was I didn't know what to do with the house after my sister died. The rooms felt like they were waiting for footsteps that weren't coming, and every time the heat kicked on, I thought it was her throwing the door open the way she used to. So I picked a ridge I'd never done in winter, packed a sandwich in a thermos, and drove until the radio gave up. The cold had teeth. When I stepped out at the trailhead, it bit the cartilage of my ears and the soft skin at the base of my neck. Bare branches scratched a low sky the color of wet concrete. I checked the map, tugged my hat down, and started up. The first hour was simple. Switchbacks stitched neatly up the slope, patches of old snow turned to gray sugar under the pines. The forest sounded like a thin machine, distant creaks, the occasional woodpecker ticking somewhere high. I kept my pace steady and counted steps when the exposure kicked in along the cliff band. Left, rock glazed in a skin of ice as smooth as blown glass. Right, 30 feet of bad decisions down to a jumble of boulders. I put my eyes where my feet were and kept going. It was somewhere after mile 2 that the sound failed. Not quieter, not a fade. It switched off. 1 second there was that far woodpecker, tap, 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 and a squirrel kicking leaves like a tiny storm. The next second there was only my breath in a white loop and the grind of my boots. The silence wasn't empty, it had weight. It pressed against my eardrums until they rang. I told myself the cold can do that. Animals hunker down. The air goes still. Nothing to worry about. I said it out loud to make it sound like a fact. Not weird. The words fell at my feet and didn't bounce. A dark knot against the trail ahead snagged my eye. Trash, I thought. Someone's dropped glove. Up close, it wasn't fabric. It was hair. A clump of it, black and coarse, matted with something too dark for mud. The strands were longer than felt right. 2 hands long, thick as rope near the root, tapering to frays like old paintbrushes. No blood I could see. No paw prints. Just the hair lying there like it had been set down on purpose. I didn't touch it. I circled wide and kept moving. Half a mile later I saw the bone. It leaned against a windfall, like it had been propped there to dry. Not deer. The curve was wrong, the shaft too thin and too long in the wrong places. The ends weren't sharp from teeth. They were polished, rounded like river stones, like something had worried them in a mouth for a very long time. I crouched. Frost filmed its surface. A low queasiness unrolled through me like a tide. I stood and told myself again, not weird, and heard how stupid it sounded in the dead air. The prints came next. Off the trail in a patch where the ground hadn't frozen yet, damp, black soil that took impressions cleanly. Foot-sized, but not. Bare. Toes too long, curling inward at the tips as if they were trying to take hold, each capped with a blunt hook that left a comma-shaped gouge. The arch sat impossibly high, almost like a crescent. The stride was wrong, too long, and even as a metronome. I followed them for 3 steps, then 4. They veered back toward the trail. And then they stopped. Not faded out. Not lost in brush. They ended in the middle of an open patch of leaves, as if the maker took one more step into air and kept going. That was the moment the idea of turning back felt worse than going forward. I can't explain it without sounding foolish. The path behind me felt like a mouth I'd have to walk into. The one ahead felt like a test I might still pass. I told myself I'd at least make the overlook and eat the sandwich, and then drop fast before the light went ugly. I had my spikes in the pack, a headlamp, extra batteries. I wasn't an idiot. I put the spikes on anyway. The quiet leaned harder. The trail pinched along a rock face near the top, so narrow I held my palm against the stone and felt cold burn through the glove. The drop on the right grew sharper. The trees below shrunk to a textured gray that ran out forever. When the path finally spit me onto the ridge, the view should have been a reward. Instead it felt like I'd stepped onto a stage with the house lights up. Sky, hills, river of road far off like a thread, everything exposed. That's when I heard the drag. Not footsteps. A long slide through dry leaves. A pause. Another drag. Close enough that my ribs tightened as if they wanted a smaller cage. I turned and saw it in the treeline. My brain tried desperately to call it a man. It was upright, mostly. Arms, legs, a head. But the proportions were wrong in a way that made my knees lose their lock. The arms hung too long, fingers nearly touching the ground. The torso looked starved and stretched, ribs like wrong-count pickets under skin the color of old paper soaked and dried too fast. The head was heavy, as if it had been borrowed from another body. It hung forward, chin almost to chest, like the neck had too many joints or not enough. It didn't move at me. It tilted its head to the side, slowly, in a curious arc that lingered 3 seconds too long, then reversed. The motion scraped something deep in me raw. Then the clicking started. Not the woodpecker's bright staccato. This was slower, wet like teeth without lips knocking together in a damp mouth. Click, click, click. A steady measure, then a stumble like it was adjusting to my heart rate. I stepped backward before I realized I had. The heels of my spikes grated on rock. The thing dropped. It didn't kneel. It collapsed to all fours as if something had cut its strings, then jerked forward in a movement too smooth to be human, too angular to be animal. Joints bent in directions mine don't. The clicking revved, faster now, a metronome spun up, then stuttered again, as if it kept forgetting how to time itself. It came low and quick, then stopped so abruptly I almost pitched over the edge because my body had started to pivot to run, and suddenly there was nothing to run from. It was 10 yards away, maybe less. Up close, the skin wasn't pale, it had a faint marbling, like veins sketched under wax. The eyes were wrong, spaced too far apart, too round, reflecting the flat gray of the sky. The mouth didn't open exactly. It unsealed in 2 places, as if what held it closed wasn't designed to pull apart. No sound came out. The clicking continued with its mouth slack. I thought of my sister in the kitchen, her bracelet chiming against the counter, the way she would tap a wooden spoon while she read a recipe. That small, bright percussion. The clicking tried to find that rhythm, and almost did. I don't remember deciding to run. 1 second I was a person with feet, the next I was a machine built to move forward. The path back along the rock face turned into a problem to solve. Don't slip. Don't look down. Don't look back. I looked back. It was on the trail, the wrong limbs working in quick, efficient bursts that ate the distance in ways my brain didn't like. Every time my boots skated on ice, it seemed to gain without moving. The silence swallowed my breathing so completely I couldn't tell if I was making noise at all. My blood tasted like iron. I lost the trail twice in the switchbacks and cut downhill through laurel thickets that clawed at my jacket. Once, a branch snapped back and caught me across the mouth. I tasted copper and spit pink onto the snow. The clicking stayed with me, sometimes close enough to feel it in my teeth, sometimes far back as if it had given me a lead for sport. The first human sound I heard in an hour was the sharp chirp of my car unlocking when I hit the fob. It was so obscene in the quiet that I almost laughed. I reached for the handle, and my stomach turned over. A smear crossed the metal, dark, fibrous, caught in the seam where the door meets the frame. A tangle of that same coarse hair. The click came once, very near, like a metered breath right behind my left ear. I flung the door open and threw myself inside, slammed it, fumbled the keys, got the engine to catch. The heater fan roared like a small airplane. I cranked the wheel, fishtailed onto the rutted approach, and didn't look in the rearview until I hit asphalt. When I did, the trees held nothing. The road behind me looked like a photograph of a place I'd never been. At home I took my jacket off in the doorway, and a few black hairs fell from the cuff to the floor. They clung to the baseboard like spider silk, then lay still. When I pinched one between 2 fingers and pulled, it didn't break. It uncoiled, longer than looked possible, and then snapped with a soft, tired sound. My apartment filled, for a second, with the memory of the ridge's silence, as if I'd opened a door and the weather had followed me inside. I told myself it was grief. The brain can draw monsters when it wants to. But when I took the trash out that night, there were tracks in the salt the landlord had thrown on the stoop. Not boots. Not paws. Bare, long-toed, hooks at the tips like commas written by a shaky hand. They led from the alley to the door and stopped at the mat. After that, only my prints went in. I found my sister's bracelet in a drawer when I got back. I don't remember putting it on, but I must have because later, when I reached to lock the deadbolt, it chimed against the metal, 2 bright taps. Out past the glass, down on the sidewalk, something answered with 2 clicks, then tried a third and made a small, puzzled sound. I turned the lock, slid the chain, and stood with my hand on the wood, breathing. The city was loud. It didn't matter. I could still hear the quiet behind it, testing the rhythm of my house, learning how to keep time. My Uncle Silas hesitated, just long enough for me to notice before he said yes. "Take the cabin if you want," he added, voice flat in that way that means there's a paragraph he's not saying. "But keep the generator off at night." "No explosions, got it," I joked. "It isn't that." He paused, and I heard the road hiss past wherever he was. "Don't wander after dark either." "Because I'll get turned around?" "Because you'll get turned around," he said, but the echo of something else rode the end of his sentence. I went anyway. Friday dusk found me chasing switchbacks into a sky that couldn't decide what color to be. The last miles weren't a road so much as a guess, trees leaning close enough that the headlights painted bars across the windshield, gravel popping under the tires. When the track pinched to 2 ruts and a prayer, the cabin finally appeared. A hunched box, porch slumped like a tired shoulder, one window catching the last light and making it look like an eye about to close. Inside smelled like old pine, cold iron, and the metallic ghost of mouse. 1 bedroom, a hand-pump kitchen, a stone fireplace with ash like gray talc. I unlocked the padlock with Silas's key, set my bag down, and listened. Nothing. Out here, the quiet isn't the absence of sound. It's a presence that leans in, waiting for you to breathe first. I found the generator where it always sat under a lean-to, a dented red cube with a pull cord that bit back. Habit said to top off the fuel, test it, let it cough to life and settle into its purr. Silas's warning put my hand back in my pocket. I checked the oil, wiped my fingers on my jeans, and left it cold. Dinner was beans and charred tortillas on the propane stove, eaten standing up, eyes moving from window to door without meaning to. I stepped onto the porch to let the pan smoke blow off and watched darkness slam down like a dropped curtain. Out here, night doesn't arrive, it takes. I locked the door. Then I locked it again, because that's what you do when there's no one to hear you scream but the wood. The horseshoe over the jamb, rusted mouth up, got a tap from habit or superstition. Maybe both. Sleep didn't stick. Every time I drifted, some part of me jerked awake like I'd missed a step. I told myself it was the wood settling, the stove pinging as iron cooled, the small search and rescue of a mouse inside a wall. Then I heard the scrape. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. A long, slow drag against the outer wall, weight behind it, the sound of something learning the grain with its hand. I sat up, breath locked small and shallow, the cheap sleeping bag hissing against itself. The scrape came again, longer, closer, ended near the kitchen window. Silence followed, so complete it hummed. I slid from the couch to the floor and reached for the hatchet I'd used to split kindling earlier. Silly weapon. Cheap comfort. I crept, floorboard sighing like an old man, toward the window and thumbed the curtain back a sliver. Wavy glass turned the world gummy and untrustworthy. The yard was a geometry of gray, stump, rain barrel, pump handle standing like a question mark. Beyond that, stacked trunks and blackness. Nothing moved. The quiet pressed a finger to my lips. The scrape started up again at the far corner, rounded the wall toward the door. Then stopped right at the jamb. I stared at the knob until my eyes watered. It didn't turn. Something exhaled, long, wet, savoring, through the crack where the sill didn't quite meet the threshold. The air in the room shifted, a copper-sweet smell sliding across it like a low tide. I might have whispered my uncle's name. I might have only thought it. Either way, I didn't open my mouth again until the sound moved away, slow steps like weight-testing old boards. Before dawn, I finally slept. When light came thin and stingy through the wavy glass, I stepped outside with the hatchet and the kind of courage daylight fakes for you. Dew-jeweled the weeds. The porch boards were darker where the damp had held on, except for a trail of prints that had shed water instead of taking it. Not boots. Not paws. Each impression was a split gouge, 2 hooked halves that had bitten the wood and released. They marched off the porch, across the yard, into the trees. I followed them 20-30 yards. The ground back there is a palimpsest of old needles and rot, good at keeping secrets, but the impressions were deep enough to hold shadow. Then mid-step, the trail ended. Not faded, ended. As if the maker had taken one more stride into air and didn't need the ground anymore. Back at the porch, something else waited. A Polaroid tucked under a rusted nail, damp but legible. The picture showed this porch, this angle, this warped board. A date scrawled under it, 1999. The image was overexposed in one corner, blowing a white flare across what might have been gouged prints, just like the ones at my feet. The handwriting belonged to my grandmother, small and neat. On the back she'd written, "Show Silas." The edges had been thumbed until the gloss peeled. Inside, above the door, a little bundle I'd never noticed before hung tucked behind the horseshoe. 3 nails bound with twine, a brass washer, and a curl of something I didn't want to identify, tied together with a knot that looked more like a diagram than a bow. A talisman, I thought, and then immediately felt foolish for thinking it. I called my uncle. He didn't pick up. I left a message I tried to keep light. "Found your decor, Captain Superstition. You could have warned me about the raccoons with knives." When I hung up, I found my hands were shaking, and not because it was cold. The sky sulked all afternoon. I stacked wood like penance. Every now and then the wind would drag through the pines and fake a footstep. By dusk, the quiet had that held quality again, like a crowd waiting for the first note of a song. I checked the door, the window latches, the horseshoe. I lifted the talisman, felt the twine bite, and put it back exactly as it was. I did not touch the generator. The first tap came just after midnight. A fingertip on glass. Another, across the room at the bedroom window. Tap, tap, like someone walking their attention around the cabin, testing. The scraping started again, faint, as if the blade doing it had dulled and grew annoyed about it. I sat with my back to the couch, hatchet across my knees, and counted my breaths to keep them from turning into small animals in my throat. Then the clicking began. I'd heard woodpeckers my whole life. This wasn't that. It was wetter, slower, teeth without lips. Click, click, click. It wasn't outside anymore. It was under the porch. The boards gave a tired groan, the way old bones talk to you when you squat. "Don't wander after dark," I said into my teeth. My voice sounded like a stolen coat, close to mine, not quite. The knob turned a degree and stopped. Something pushed against the door, a steady, testing pressure that made the jamb tick, and the chair I'd wedged beneath the knob squeal a millimeter. The horseshoe didn't move. The talisman swayed once, the washer catching a mote of lantern light and turning it into a dull coin. "Mara." The voice came like air forced through wet cloth. It got the M right, then had to feel around for the rest. "Ma'are." Every muscle in me wanted to answer the way blood answers gravity. My uncle's voice walked into my head. "Keep the generator off at night." I understood, finally, what he meant. Sound carries. Heat smells. The purr would be a beacon, the fuel a sweetness. I held my mouth shut with my hand and let the name starve on the air. The voice circled the walls, tried the flue, tried the sill. At the kitchen window, something thin wormed into the crack in the sash and sawed at the wood. A long shaving fell, pale as a fingernail. Another. The smell got stronger, copper, fruit gone over, something animal trying to pretend it wasn't. The clicking sped up like a metronome pushed by a nervous hand. It stopped all at once. Then the porch steps flexed as weight withdrew. Silence fell the way it had on the road getting here, as if someone had turned off the switch for sound. I breathed again, and didn't realize until the breath came cold and raw that I'd been holding it long enough to hurt. I must have slept, the body insisting where the mind refused. When I opened my eyes, the lantern had died. A pale daylight leak outlined the window. I stood, every joint arguing, and unbolted the door. Tracks everywhere. On the porch. Down the steps. A line across the yard to the generator lean-to and back. The gouges were deeper at the lean-to. The dirt clawed in crescents around the red cube. Something had pressed its face to the vented side, leaving a faint, greasy oval with 2 round dull marks where eyes might be if eyes were flat coins. The pull cord was out an inch farther than I'd left it. A smear of dark, fibrous material clung to the handle like a strand caught on a nail. I packed with the efficiency of a person late to flee a fire. Bag, jacket, hatchet, Polaroid slipped into my back pocket. I locked the door because that's what people do, even when they know locks are a story you tell yourself. On impulse, I pulled the talisman down, hesitated, and hung it back. The washer spun once, then went still. The trees watched me walk to the truck. At the last bend before the highway, I saw it at the tree line, crouched low as if leaning on its arms like crutches. Skin stretched thin enough to show wrong bones. Head tilted just off center, like it was listening to a bad radio. The jaw opened too far and didn't close quite right. It didn't chase. It didn't need to. It watched me go like a teacher watches a child copy a word off the board. Uncle Silas called that night after 2 bourbons, his voice soft around the edges. "You kept the generator off?" he asked. "I did." "Good." He breathed like he'd set down a weight. "The hum brings it. The fuel, too. Smell goes sweet on the wind. Learned that in '99. "I found your picture," I said. "Grandma's handwriting. Show Silas." He was quiet so long I thought the line had died. "We don't put it in the papers," he said finally. "Folks think meth head, bear, fever dream. Maybe it is. Just don't say your name if you hear it. Don't make a sound that tells it what you are. And if you go back," he stopped. "Don't go back." "I won't," I said, and meant it in the way people mean things they want to keep meaning. When I took my jacket off, a thin hooked sliver fell from the cuff, translucent like a fish scale, ridged like a fingernail, warm against my palm for a second, as if it remembered a body and couldn't quite let go. I dropped it. It stuck to the floor for a heartbeat before coming loose. The room tasted like pennies and overripe fruit until I opened a window and let the city in. I sleep with earplugs now. Not because of traffic. Because in the hollow space between the building's night noises, I can still hear the purr of a generator I didn't start and the beat of clicking learning my name 1 syllable at a time. Sunday nights are for mistakes you can call shortcuts until they aren't. I'd been at my cousin Bram's place all afternoon, splitting rounds till my hands buzzed. The light was already thinning when I left, and the main road meant 30 extra minutes of double yellow tedium. The logging track, 20 miles of ridge and hollow, a mud-sucked ribbon nobody maintains, saves you half an hour if the ruts haven't eaten themselves into trenches. I turned onto it without thinking, tires humming as gravel gave way to clay. The woods were damp from a fast storm, those angry spring fronts that rip through, dump a sheet, then leave the sky bruised and sulking. Everything smelled rinsed and metallic. The kind of quiet where your own breathing sounds like a secret you shouldn't share. 6 miles in, a poplar blocked the track. Not fallen crooked. Laid perfectly crosswise, trunk thick as a barrel, roots clawing the air like a hand reaching up. I killed the engine and stepped into the kind of silence that feels like a lid screwed on too tight. My boots sank. The underside of the trunk was shaved clean of bark, not dragged raw, not torn. Shaved. Smooth as bone, pale where the cambium should have been. Sap, the color of tea, slicked the grain. It beaded at the edge of the cuts in slow fat drops that caught what little light was left and made it look wet in a way skin looks wet when it shouldn't be. The roots weren't snapped, they were chewed. Deep curved grooves curling in on themselves, crescents you could slide 2 fingers into if you were an idiot. A ribbon of pulp hung from one bite and swung when I breathed on it. Strings of woody fiber wove between the gnawed ends like tendons. A smell slid up off the wounds. Not rot. Not fresh green. Copper and something sweet. Overripe fruit left in a warm kitchen, thick enough I tasted it. It stuck to the back of my tongue. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, like that would change anything. I circled the root ball, half thinking I could lever the trunk with the jack and rock it enough to nose my truck around. That was a joke. My phone had no bars. Of course it didn't. The last farmhouse is 3 ridges back, and even that one's more rumor than map. Metal scraped stone under the truck. Just that, one slow, deliberate drag. Not a twig pinging the muffler. Not the frame popping as it cooled. A hand with something hard in it, pulling along steel. I went still everywhere at once. The engine was dead. The keys were in my palm. The only sound was my pulse kicking against my jaw. I crouched and looked under the truck, which is a thing no one in a horror story should do, and I did it anyway. Mud. Leaves stuck to the cross members. The shadowed belly of my own bad decisions. Nothing else. The smell got louder in the quiet. I told myself I was jumpy because the storm had rattled me, and because I hadn't eaten since noon. I told myself to get back in the cab, lock the doors, and think like a person who doesn't catastrophize. I put my hand on the door handle. The woods moved. Not everything, just a shape between 2 pines. Pale and low and gliding, like paper sliding across a floor. My brain tried deer. Deer don't move like spilled milk. It slipped behind a trunk and was gone. I slammed the locks without meaning to. The loudest sound in the county. I sat with my spine rigid and my breath shallow and my fingers cramped around the keys. You don't realize how much you count on background noise until there isn't any. The woods had the feel of a crowd holding its breath. The scrape came again, this time on the bed. A long, slow drag that I felt through the seat frame. Then a thud, single, heavy, like a sack of wet concrete dropping onto the tailgate. The truck rocked forward an inch. The seatbelt clicked where it hung against the pillar. My chest stuttered. I turned the key. The engine coughed, then caught, then roared like a friend. I punched the gas. The rear tires spun in mud so slick it felt sentient. Clay hissed and spat. Then the tread bit and the truck lunged. I didn't aim so much as choose away. The mirror flipped the world small. I told myself not to look. I looked. It ran in the center of the track behind me, not fast, not panicked, just keeping pace on a bad grade like gravity applied to me and not to it. Upright, sort of. Shoulders bent like broken wings. Arms too long, almost draping the ground with each stride. The head hung forward, jaw slack, and then the jaw dropped farther without effort until I thought the whole face would split. It did not bounce. It flowed. Pale skin flashed white gold in the last of the light. Eyes were just round black holes that didn't throw any shine back. I floored it. We fishtailed, kissed a ditch, corrected, fishtailed again. Trees went by like ribs. I didn't blink. 100 yards of ruts later, the track curled around a knuckle in the hill, and the thing vanished into the geometry of trunks. I didn't lift my foot until the tires hit blessed, stupid, municipal asphalt. I drove 10 miles past my turn with my hands welded into claws. When I finally pulled into the blue-lit lot of a chain pharmacy, I sat shaking so hard my teeth buzzed against each other. The copper sweet taste rode with me like a passenger. The tailgate was bent. Not dented. Bent inward at the center, as if something had set its weight on it and settled. For deep gouges ran across the metal in curling arcs. Not scratches, not straight, curled like hooks had bit and dragged. The grooves had heat bloom at the edges, paint feathered up like blistered skin. Between the gouges, something fibrous had caught in the seam. A translucent sliver curved like a thumbnail, ridged like shell. When I pulled it free with my key, it flexed once and made a sound so small I could have imagined it. I slept with the porch light on like the bulb could do something about the dark between the trees. Bram came over the next morning, because that's what cousins do when you call and your voice can't find the right shape to sit in. He ran his hand over the tailgate and whistled low. "Somebody hate you," he said. "Bear got up there and went to town?" "Bears don't carve cursive," I said, and that was the last time either of us laughed about it. At the body shop, the owner, Epp, touched the bent metal with the calm hands of a man who's seen every way a truck can be hurt. "Huh," he said, in the dangerous tone that means never seen it, never want to again. He turned his head, squinted one eye, leaned in. "Claw marks don't curl like that. You'd need leverage." Or, he didn't finish. He looked at me instead, taking my measure the way men do when they think maybe you hit a deer and left it and want a story that makes it right. He pried something out of the seam with a pick and set it on his palm. "You bring this with you?" The sliver lay there dumb and obscene. He pressed with a thumbnail. It flexed and then sprang back. "Hardened keratin, if I had to guess," he said, and immediately looked embarrassed for having said keratin. "Like a nail. Or hoof. Or," he stopped again. "You want the tailgate replaced?" "Yes," I said. That night I pulled the SD card from my dashcam, because sleep wasn't coming, and answers are a chemical we chase. The footage was mud, trees, the shudder of the truck, stars of rain on the lens. But when the tailgate hit, the jolt froze the camera for 3 frames. In the first, nothing. In the second, something pale at the top edge of the glass, blurred by motion. In the third, a hand. Too long in the palm. Too many knuckle ridges. Hooked tips glinting not with light, but with the absence of it, like they ate the reflection. I shut the laptop. My apartment smelled like pennies and cut apples, even with the window open. The dreams didn't bother to be subtle. I'd be back at the poplar, and the shaved wood would be skin, and the grooves in the roots would open like a mouth. I'd dig my fingers in because stories make you do the worst possible thing, and the pulp would be warm, and something inside would pull back. I'd wake biting on a shout, jaw aching like I'd chewed rope. I sold the truck the same week. Epp took the tailgate off and replaced it with a clean one from a salvage yard. He slid the old one against the back wall of the shop while the paperwork printed and told me a story about a guy who drove into a cowshed. Anything to make it a normal day. When I left, the old tailgate leaned there like a pulled tooth. The gouges caught the light and made a shape that looked like writing if you didn't want to read it. 2 nights later, I woke to a sound I haven't heard since I was 8 and reading under a blanket. The bed of a truck settling after you jump off it. Except I don't have a truck anymore. My window looks down on the narrow strip of gravel by the dumpsters where the building's one tree has bullied itself into existence. The noise came again, a soft, heavy thud. Then a drag, metal on stone, slow and certain, like someone drawing a line they mean you to see. I didn't go to the window. I lay there with the covers slack over my face like that could make the world forget the shape of me. The copper-sweet smell slid under the door from the hallway and made the room feel used. On the other side of the wall, a neighbor's baby turned over and made a small, confused sound the way creatures do when the air changes. In the morning, 4 curling gouges ran along the paint of the dumpster lid. A strand of something pale and ridged lay on the gravel, flexing when wind walked past it, then going still. When I told Bram I was thinking about moving, he didn't say because of a road. He said, "I'll help you pack." He added, "Don't take that track again," like I needed the reminder. Then he said, "Calder, don't answer if you hear your name on the quiet. It can sound like a lot of things. None of them are you." The next storm came through hot and fast, frothing the creeks and combing the trees flat. I lay on the couch and listened to the thunder walk the ridge, counting the beats between flash and crack. Somewhere out there a poplar fell and laid itself across a track I won't ever see again. Somewhere the stripped cambium shone like something private. Somewhere, something put its hands on a red metal box and leaned in, as if listening to its heart. I don't run out of gas anymore. I don't take shortcuts. I don't look in my mirrors when the road goes black and straight and the windows load up with my own face. If I hear a scrape, I let it belong to what made it, and I keep my mouth closed tight. The world has rules we pretend we wrote. Some things don't need the road. Some things learn your rhythm and then wait for you to come home, where the distance is measured in drywall, not miles, and the tailgate you took off is still leaned up somewhere with your fingerprints on it, bent in the middle like a grin. The service road stretched ahead like a scar through the pines, my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the darkness. 23 years I'd been driving this route home from the ranger station, and it never got easier. Just me, the truck, and whatever was breathing in the woods beyond the tree line. My radio crackled with static, the same rhythmic interference that had been plaguing the frequencies all week. Tick, 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 like fingernails on glass. I reached over to adjust the dial, but the sound persisted, weaving through the white noise like something alive. The missing hiker flyer sat crumpled on my passenger seat, edges worn from handling. Sarah Chun, 24, last seen on the Blackwood Trail 3 days ago. What made my skin crawl wasn't her disappearance. People got lost in these mountains all the time. It was the symbols carved into the trees where her backpack was found. The same twisted marks I'd been seeing etched into bark for months now, always deeper, always fresher. Always in places where the missing had last been spotted. The static grew louder. Tick, tick, tick. I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to get home to my cabin, to a hot meal and something stronger than coffee. The headlights swept across familiar landmarks, the lightning-split oak, the rusted mile marker, Something was lying across the road. I slammed the brakes, gravel spraying as the truck skidded to a stop. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the shape sprawled across both lanes. At first glance, it looked like a fallen tree, maybe debris from the storm last week. But trees don't have joints. Trees don't bend in places that make your eyes water to follow. The thing was pale, almost luminescent in the headlight glare. Impossibly long limbs stretched from shoulder to shoulder across the narrow road, each appendage twisted at angles that hurt to comprehend. What I'd initially mistaken for bark was skin, mottled, stretched tight over a frame that seemed designed by something that had only heard descriptions of human anatomy secondhand. The radio static intensified. Tick, 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 tick. I sat frozen, engine idling, watching for any sign of movement. The thing lay perfectly still, face down against the asphalt. If it had a face. The proportions were all wrong, too long, too narrow, like someone had grabbed a person by the head and feet and pulled until something snapped. Minutes crawled by. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I should radio for backup, but the static was so thick now I doubted anything would get through. I should get out, check if it was injured, but every instinct screamed against leaving the truck. Then it moved. Not a twitch or spasm, a deliberate, fluid motion that started at what might have been fingertips and rippled up those impossible arms. The joints bent backward as it pressed its palms against the road, and I realized with sick certainty that this thing had been waiting. Listening to my engine approach, feeling the vibrations through the asphalt. It began to rise. The movement was wrong in every conceivable way. limbs unfolded like a spider emerging from a drain, each segment extending with wet, organic sounds that carried clearly through my closed windows. As it lifted itself, I caught glimpses of its underside, pale flesh marked with those same carved symbols, the lines weeping something dark that reflected my headlights. The static reached a crescendo. Tick, 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 tick. When it finally stood, it towered above my truck. 8 feet, maybe 9, but the proportions made it seem even larger. Its head, if that's what hung from those narrow shoulders, tilted toward me with a sound like breaking kindling. I couldn't make out features in the glare, just the suggestion of hollows where eyes should be and a mouth that seemed to split too wide across what passed for a face. It took a step sideways, clearing the lane with movements that belonged in deep water, not on solid ground. Each footfall produced that same clicking sound, like bone on stone. The radio static matched the rhythm perfectly now, as if the two sounds were connected by invisible wires. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. My foot found the accelerator, and I floored it, gravel and dust exploding behind me as the truck lurched forward. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, refusing to look at the thing as I passed. But I felt it watching, felt its attention like ice water in my veins. Only when I'd put a quarter-mile between us did I dare check the rearview mirror. It stood exactly where I'd left it, perfectly motionless in the center of the road. My taillights painted it red in the distance, but even at this range I could see it hadn't moved, hadn't turned to follow. It simply watched, patient as stone, as I fled deeper into the mountains. The static faded as I drove, the clicking rhythm dissolving back into white noise. By the time I reached my cabin, the radio was silent except for the occasional weather update from the valley station. I sat in the truck for a long time after cutting the engine, staring at my front door. The porch light cast familiar shadows across the wooden steps, and everything looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. Normal. Safe. It wasn't until I finally worked up the courage to get out that I noticed the gravel. Fresh furrows cut across my driveway, too deep and too wide to be tire tracks. They led from the tree line to my front steps in a perfectly straight line, as if something had dragged itself across the stones. The marks were still settling, tiny avalanches of displaced gravel trickling into the grooves. I followed the trail with my flashlight, beam shaking in my unsteady grip. The furrows ended at my porch, but there were other marks in the wood, long scratches that bit deep into the planks, arranged in groups of 4. The same symbols from the missing hiker reports. Fresh carved. Still weeping sap. Inside, I double-checked every lock, drew every curtain, and loaded my service weapon with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The radio sat silent on my kitchen table, but I could swear I still heard that rhythmic clicking, faint as a heartbeat, coming from somewhere in the walls. I never did find Sarachin. The work order said pole 117 needed a routine inspection. Nothing more than checking the guy wires and looking for woodpecker damage along the Bonneville Power Administration's transmission corridor outside Troutdale, Oregon. I'd been walking these lines for Pacific Power for 8 years, and the stretch between the Sandy River and the Columbia Gorge was as familiar to me as my own backyard. The Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches occasionally brushing the 500 kV lines with that distinctive crackling sound that made tourists nervous but put me to sleep. It was October 15th, 2023. I remember the date because I wrote it in my logbook right before everything went sideways. The morning fog was just burning off the Cascade foothills, and I could see Mount Hood's peak catching the early sunlight through the canopy. My EMF detector, a Trifield TF2 I'd carried for years, was giving normal readings as I approached the substation access road off Highway 26. The gate's padlock was standard issue, same Masterlock 410 series we used throughout the district. I logged the entry time, 0847 hours. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way down the maintenance corridor, following the orange survey flags that marked the right-of-way. Pole 117 stood about 200 yards in, a standard 85-foot steel lattice tower carrying 3 phases of transmission line toward the Dalles. That's when I noticed the circle. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Maybe 12 feet in diameter, the earth was black, not the rich black of Oregon soil, but an oily, light-absorbing black that seemed to drink in the morning sun. The grass around the perimeter looked normal, healthy even, but inside that circle nothing grew. The ground had a wet sheen to it, like crude oil, but when I knelt down and touched it with my work glove, it came away dry. My EMF detector started clicking. Not the steady background hum you'd expect near high-voltage lines, but an erratic, almost panicked clicking that made my teeth ache. The needle was jumping between normal readings and completely off the scale. I'd never seen anything like it in 8 years of line work. I was so focused on the readings that I almost missed the movement. At first, I thought it was a tarp or maybe a piece of insulation that had blown down from the lines. It was pale, almost translucent, and it was twitching at the base of pole 117. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't insulation. It was skin. A sheet of it, maybe 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, stretched out like someone had carefully peeled it off and laid it flat. But it was moving, not blowing in the wind, but actually contracting and expanding like it was breathing. The surface had that parchment quality you see on really old people, covered in a network of blue veins that pulsed with a rhythm that definitely wasn't my heartbeat. The smell hit me then. Copper sweet, like sucking on pennies, but underneath that was something else, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. I gagged and took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio clipped to my vest. That's when it stood up. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me. What I'd thought was skin on the ground was actually part of it, some kind of membrane or wing that it had been lying on. The body was humanoid but wrong in every possible way. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in directions that made my eyes water to follow. But the face, Jesus Christ, the face. It looked almost normal from a distance. Pale, gaunt, but recognizably human. Then it opened its mouth, and I watched in horror as its jaw split vertically down the middle, opening like a flower to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth and a throat that seemed to go down forever. The copper smell got stronger, and I could hear this wet clicking sound coming from deep inside its chest. For maybe 3 seconds, we just stared at each other. My EMF detector was going absolutely insane now, clicking so fast it sounded like a Geiger counter in a uranium mine. The thing tilted its head, too far, nearly 90 degrees, and I swear I could see intelligence in those black eyes. It was studying me. Then it dropped to all fours and charged. I've never run so fast in my life. My work boots slipped on the wet leaves as I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my safety vest. Behind me, I could hear it moving, not running exactly, but flowing through the forest like water, barely disturbing the undergrowth. When I risked a glance back, I saw it moving between the trees with impossible grace, its split jaw hanging open, and that membrane trailing behind it like a grotesque cape. I made it to my truck in what felt like hours, but was probably less than 2 minutes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the access road, spraying gravel, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw it standing at the edge of the tree line. It had risen to its full height again, maybe 8 feet tall, just watching me go. Even from that distance, I could see its jaw slowly closing, returning to that almost human appearance. It raised one impossibly long arm in what might have been a wave. I drove straight back to the district office in Gresham and filed my report. Equipment malfunction, I wrote. Pole 117 inspection incomplete due to EMF anomaly. Recommend follow-up with engineering team. That night, I went through the shift schedule and quietly swapped out every assignment that would take me back to that section of line. When my supervisor asked why, I told him I was having some personal issues and needed to work closer to town for a while. He didn't push it. 3 weeks later, I was cleaning out my glove box when I found something I didn't remember putting there. A red tag, the kind we use to mark equipment that's been taken out of service. In my own handwriting it read, "Do not energize pole 117, biological hazard, contact district supervisor before proceeding." I don't remember writing it. Last month, I heard from Jake Morrison, another lineman who works the Eastern District. He mentioned something weird during our safety meeting, a perfect circle of dead earth that seemed to be moving along the transmission corridor. Started near pole 117, he said, but now it's showing up near pole 134, then 151. Always the same size, always that oily black color. Always moving east, following the power lines toward the Dallas. I put in for early retirement last week. 30 years with the company, they said. Good pension, full benefits. They threw me a party at the Elks Lodge on Powell Boulevard, and everyone talked about what a dedicated employee I'd been, how I'd never missed an inspection, never filed a false report. If they only knew. Dad said it would be a quick run. In, grabbed the camo bins he'd left in the attic crawl, checked the roof for sag before the first real snow, out by midnight with a Waffle House stop if we didn't piss off the weather. I said leaving at 4 in the afternoon was late. He said we'd be fine, the way he always said it, like the world would rearrange itself to keep his word true. The older I get, the more I notice the seams in his confidence. The white crescent scar that hooks from his ear into the hairline. The way he never parks with the woods at his back. The rabbit's foot keychain he pretends is a joke. When I was little and asked about the scar, he said barbed wire. When I was 13 and asked again, he said barbed wire and a bad dog. By 26 I'd stopped asking. We carry some stories for each other by not making the other say them. The cabin sat 2 hours into the mountains, then 30 minutes off anything paved. It belonged to his father and his father's father, and every autumn they went to remember the shape of being quiet. I grew up on those weekends, learning that gasoline smells like fall, that mouse droppings look like spilled cumin, that coffee boiled too long tastes like dark pennies. More than once I'd fallen asleep to Dad and my uncle humming along to a radio preacher, and woken up to deer quarters wrapped in butcher paper, stacked like bricks in the back of the truck. I drove while he navigated, because he knows the turns by trees, left at the birch with the lightning scar, right where the ridge squeezes the road down to one lane and the guardrail gives up. The sun slid down behind the black ribs of the mountains. The last gas station we passed had a jack-o'-lantern on the counter and a girl with a lip ring who eyed Dad like a man who owned the land around here instead of a man who kept slipping through it. When the pavement ended, the truck pitched onto ruts rimmed with old snow, the kind that lingers in shadows and ditches like mold. Branches brushed the doors like cats that didn't want to be touched. I slowed to a crawl. "We could turn back," I said, because it felt like a line I should say. He flicked a glance at me, then at the windshield. "We'll make it before dark," he said. We did not. The road was a tunnel of our own light, bleach white on trunks, black just beyond it. Somewhere far away a creek talked rocks into moving, and then forgot what it was saying. I kept to the center line of mud to avoid the soft, treacherous edges. When the thing ran across the beams, I didn't hit the brakes so much as forget I had feet. It went on all fours where a deer would go on too. Too long in the middle, too thin at the limbs. It didn't leap. It flowed low, like poured batter finding a pan. White not with snow, but with skin that threw our lights back in a way that wasn't shine so much as refusal. Then it was gone into the trees, and the only proof it had ever been in front of us was the way my hands hurt from tightening around the wheel. "What was that?" I said. Dad said, "Probably nothing," and the carefulness in his voice made my neck go cold. The clearing was a black bite out of the trees, and the cabin was smaller than my memory had left it. I parked nose-out habit. Dad didn't comment, which told me he noticed and didn't mind. We got out into silence, so complete it had a texture. No bugs. No wind. Just the engine tick-ticking as it shed heat, like a thing trying to become less alive. Inside smelled like old wood and dust, with a rancid thread that said a mouse had died somewhere the stovepipe couldn't reach. The table was the same scarred slab. The bunks the same 2 backs of spines stacked in the corner. The Polaroids along the wall, curled under the thumbtacks, held black and white men who looked like my father without needing to be my father. We lit the lanterns. He locked the door, an act I'd never seen him do out here. It made a single simple sound that felt like writing your name without lifting the pen. "Roof in the morning," he said. "Bins tonight." I pulled the ladder down for the crawl space and sent a roost of mouse dust into the air. While I hauled the plastic tubs down, I found last year's calendar still thumbtacked up, a rust-flushed pin-up, smiling over her shoulder with a coyness older than both of us. Her smile seemed different in this light, all teeth and effort. YouTube would put a black bar over that hip, I thought, and got angry at myself for thinking in filters instead of feelings. We ate chili straight from the pot because it was warm and easy. The stove clicked and popped as if remembering conversations. I tried to tell him about a girl, about the way my life felt like an air mattress with one slow leak you can't find. He listened like men listen, eyes on the door, head nodding, the whole of his attention a quiet presence even when he wasn't looking at you. When the scrape came along the far wall, our heads turned in the same breath. Not a branch, not a casual bump, a slow, deliberate drag, as if something was learning the grain with its palm. It started near the back and came toward the door. I stood so fast the chair legs squealed on the floor. Dad didn't stand. He reached for the rifle in the corner. He broke the action, checked nothing and everything in one glance, then moved to the door sideways, like a man who'd learned to keep his profile small. He threw the bolt, yanked the door open, and knifed the dark with the flashlight. Nothing. Just the truck going cold, the breathless black of trees. The scrape had stopped the second the door moved, like a kid caught with their hand in a jar. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching old snow. The beam walked the ground, slid up the siding, paused. He didn't go far. He didn't take his eyes off the corner where the wall met the porch. "Stay here," he said, without turning. His voice wasn't the soft dad voice. It was the sound your name makes when it decides to anchor itself to something heavy. I watched his back go into shadow. A thrum started in my thighs that felt like I'd run a mile I didn't remember. When he came back, his face had been washed of expression, which on him reads like fear in other men. He set the rifle down with too much care. "Pack what you've got," he said. "We're leaving." "What is it?" "Pack," he said again, and the second time made my body move. At the window, in the glass that makes everything look like it's melting, I saw the yard, the black ground carved with dragged crescents. Not boots. Not paws. Hands and feet stretched long, the digits gouging like hooks. The stride was too far, as if the body had been drawn out and then hinged wrong. It had circled the cabin. The second loop was tighter. The third came onto the porch. The marks stopped at the door like a chalk line. We didn't talk. We didn't become silly. We loaded in the animal way. Dad kept the rifle up, fingers ready, not trembling, and that steadiness scared me more than anything. When I climbed into the truck, the leather grabbed at my sweat the way mouths do in bad dreams. The headlights bit into the clearing, and the trees beyond it did what trees do when they don't want to be seen. They stood. We rolled out of the clearing, and something moved with us. Not crashing through brush, not making a moment of it. It stayed in the band of dark just beyond the lights, the way a bad memory keeps pace until you name it. When the road turned and the ditch yawned, I saw it in the sliver where the beams spilled through, low, serpent-fast, limbs working like levers more than legs. It slid behind a trunk, and the trunk seemed relieved to have it. 100 yards later, Dad said, "Safety," in a voice that had nothing to do with the rifle. "What?" He pulled the rifle into his lap and worked the safety off with his thumb. He checked the chamber. The click sounded small and obscene. When he glanced at me, he looked embarrassed. "Forgot," he said, as if admitting to nudity. "Don't tell your mother." I laughed in a way that made my throat hurt. Sometimes humor is a sheet you pull over a shape and pretend you don't see the outline. We hit the last bend before the county road, and the ditch tried to jump into the passenger seat. I wrestled us straight. The tires found asphalt like a hand finds a pulse. I let out air I must have been saving for when we died. Dad looked sideways at the black behind us, then forward, then said, "That wasn't an animal." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. The sentence landed between us like a third person we both knew. We didn't stop until the lights of town made the windshield smear with reflections. At the first 24-hour diner, we pulled in and sat with the engine running, staring out at nothing like it might try to talk back. My hands wouldn't unclench from the wheel. Dad's rabbit foot swung against his keys, thumping his knee in a metronome soft enough to pretend it wasn't there. "Barbed wire?" I asked before I could stop myself, looking at the scar. He touched it like a ritual, 2 fingers, quick. "Barbed wire," he said. Then, after a beat, and a bad dog. The corner of his mouth twitched like it wanted to be honest, and decided to live another day. Back at the house, Mom asked why we'd wasted gas for nothing. Dad said, "Roof's fine." I said, "Bins are in the truck," and we both pretended those sentences were the things we'd gone for. I showered until the water went cold and still couldn't wash off the coppery sweetness I felt had filmed my tongue. In the mirror, my face looked like a portrait someone had wiped and redrawn, slightly wrong at the edges. The next morning, I walked out to the truck for my coffee mug. Snow had dusted overnight. I stood very still and assessed the sheet of white like a test. On the porch steps there were impressions. Not heavy enough to sink all the way, but definite. Long toes, hooks at the ends, spaced too far apart. They started at the yard and stopped at the top step, where Dad's boot prints took over. Snow as forensic paper. The story written even when no one wanted to read it. At lunch, Dad set a manila envelope in front of me. The deed. The keys, heavy and ordinary on top. "Your grandfather made me promise not to sell," he said. "Said places carry men through the lean years, not the other way around." He looked at the rabbit's foot, then at my face. "I can't keep his promise and mine." "What promise is yours?" He took a breath so long I heard the edges of it. "Not to take my son back to someplace that wants to keep him." We drove to the post office. He slid the keys into a padded mailer addressed to my uncle 2 states away and asked for the slowest, dumbest shipping they still offer, the kind that loses things sometimes. At home, we carried the grill out even though it was January, and lit a fire in its belly. The deed went and folded twice, then once more. The paper blackened at the corners, curled, and dropped to a skeleton of ash that looked like a bug. We watched until nothing glowed. That night, I woke to the whisper of the furnace and the sound, imagined real, it doesn't matter, of something saying my name wrong outside the bedroom window, tasting the syllables like a new word you aren't sure you can own. I stayed still and let it pass like a fever dream. Somewhere down the hall, Dad's floorboard creaked in the pattern I grew up to. He stood a long time in the doorway and didn't say anything. I took the mountain road because the interstate makes me feel like a barcode. It was late, I was sore from a week of crawling under houses for work, and my playlist was stuck on early 2000s bangers that sounded dirtier than I remembered. Somewhere after the last town, the curves started breeding with themselves. Switchback after switchback, the shoulder a rumor, no guardrails, just a white line in black air if you got it wrong. The fuel light blinked on like an accusation. A hair under a quarter tank. Fine in daylight. A problem out here where the GPS had already thrown up its hands. My brain started doing the math you do when you're tired. Miles per gallon, uphill versus downhill, the fantasy of a station that did not exist. I told myself I'd pull off, stretch, check the map, get my head right, then coast the descents to save fuel like that's anything but superstition. The gravel turnout was barely big enough for 2 cars. It felt like a favor I hadn't earned. I eased in, killed the engine, and the world went hard silent fast, like someone had put a bell jar over the mountains. No bugs. No wind. Even my phone's screen seemed to glow too loud. 5 minutes, I told the empty road, like time works better when you announce it. I opened the door, and the hinge squeak sounded like a scream in church. Cold air slid under my jacket, and found all the damp places. The clicking started while I was stretching my lower back. Faint. Too clean to be branches, too spaced to be normal footsteps. Click. Click. Not nails on stone so much as the sound of a tongue finding the roof of a mouth, slow and deliberate, like someone practicing the idea of eating. I froze, turned my head like a puppet. The tree line was a black seam with teeth. I could hear my breath come back at me off the hood. Bear, I said because a named fear is smaller. Coyote. Saying person would have been worse. The click repeated, closer now, matched to my pulse the way a metronome bullies a song into time. Something breathed, long and savoring, like it was smelling through me instead of at me. I reached for the door handle. My fingers slipped on the cold chrome and left damp smears that felt obscene. The dome light came on when I leaned in for the phone on the dash. That's when I saw them, 2 dull coins catching the light at knee height. Not glowing. Reflecting wrong. They rose in a slow, confident elevator ride until they were above the hood line. I didn't move. Neither did it. The figure stepped out of the trees like a confession. Taller than the SUV. Too long in the limbs, joints bending like someone had sketched them from memory and got bored halfway through. Its skin didn't shine so much as reject darkness. The head tipped toward me in 3 tiny, bird-jerk increments. The mouth was too wide in a way that would have been funny if it wasn't attached to the part of me that wants to run. I thought of a billboard I'd passed that afternoon, lingerie and a model arching like a question mark, and I hated my brain for calling that up now. The thing cocked its head as if it had heard the thought, which is dumb, I know, but I flinched anyway. The copper-sweet smell came then, the one I've never forgotten since. Pennies and bruised fruit, breath warmed against wet stone. Move, I whispered to myself. Tamsin, move. It did first, one slow, exact step to the right, as if testing the geometry of me and the car. Then the mouth opened, and my voice came out. Run, it said. My voice. Not a good impression. My exact voice, like it had recorded me late at night telling a joke and shaved the laugh off the end. The dome light hummed like it had opinions. The word hung there between us, and the cruel part of me that likes evidence thought, if it speaks again, I'll have proof. I moved. Or my body did on a delay I wasn't part of. I slid into the seat, hip smashing the frame, scrambled for the keys that had fallen to the mat, felt them bite my palm, jammed them into the ignition with shaking that had a rhythm all its own. While I fumbled, the clicking circled the SUV. It was wrong how fast it moved, wrong how the sound kept pace with itself. Right window. Left. Behind. In front. It clicked like a tongue pressed to teeth, like a metronome speeding up in a bad rehearsal. The engine caught so loud it felt like I'd broken a rule. Gravel spat, and the rear swung out before catching. I rocketed back onto the ribbon of road and took the next curve too hot, tires singing a thin, panicked note. In the mirror, for half a second, I saw it standing in the turnout exactly where I'd been. Head cocked, arms hanging like broken branches, as still as a mannequin that knows you can't afford it. I didn't look back again until the first sodium streetlight smudged the black. In the diner lot, my hands had to be pried off the wheel one finger at a time like a stuck lid. The neon buzz forced sound back into the world. Grease smell, coffee, a fry cook tapping tongs, and a rhythm that hurt. I stayed in the car until the tremor bled out. When I finally went in, the night cook, a woman with a faded rose tattoo and eyeliner like armor, watched me from the pass. "You good?" she asked. "Got spooked," I said. "Saw a bear. Bears don't stand up and think about you." She nodded at my back window. "Fresh dust," she added, and I flinched like she'd touched me. "From where you pulled off," she explained. "My brother drives that road. Says it eats cars. Didn't see any lights on it tonight, though. You the only one came in." I don't know why that felt like a verdict. I drank coffee until my hands remembered they were mine. When I stepped back out, the world was dew-slick and tired. Two thin gouges had appeared in my rear tire's sidewall, curled arcs like something had tasted the rubber. Not punctures. Not enough to strand me. Just two neat marks like quotation marks on a sentence I hadn't realized I was writing. Home should have solved it. A shower, a second shower. Laundry spinning at midnight. I pulled my phone to throw on a podcast loud enough to drown the memory, and saw the screen already open to voice memos. A new file sat on top with a timestamp tagged to the turnout. I didn't remember hitting record. I put it on speaker, because apparently I like to do things the dumbest way first. The hiss of night. My own off-key hum while I stretched. The tiny click of my door, louder because of the phone's mic. Then the long, savoring inhale I'd tried to tell myself was nothing. The scrape of gravel. A small noise I made that I didn't know I made. Half gasp, half swear, half swallowed. Yes, that's three halves. It felt like that. Footsteps that weren't footsteps. And then my voice. "Run," it said. No engine. No tires. Just that word in my own throat coming from outside my body. I shared it to my laptop before my courage could give up. I watched the waveform jitter and grow taller at the word. I clipped it, boosted it, told myself I was only doing what a curious person would do. When I slowed it down, the vowel thickened, tore like the speaker had too much mouth and not enough tongue. Under the word was a faint second track, out of time with the first. A wet, patient clicking, steady like a metronome for chewing. I did not sleep. When the heat kicked on at 3 a.m., I flinched so hard my legs cramped. I paced. I considered going back to the car to check the tire again, then pictured two more neat quotation marks carved beside the first two, and stayed inside, practicing keeping my mouth shut.